Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 280 Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev is only a couple weeks away, and this is one of the most anticipated fight cards of the year. It's crazy stacked from top to bottom. But, you look back a month and you look at UFC 279, some video content I did on UFC 279. It inspired me to make a video, the top 3 reasons I hate UFC 280. Now, do I actually hate UFC 280? No, but these are 3 legitimate complaints I have about the UFC 280 in Abu Dhabi card. And the number one reason actually infuriates me, but I'm going to go from 3 to 1, 3 being, it's kind of annoying, but 1 actually drives me nuts. And if you've, been following the channel for any substantial period of time, you've heard me talk about this reason on a couple live streams, but we're going to get to that in a minute. But before I get into any of that, I am not delusional. Okay, there's going to be someone commenting down below saying, you're delusional, you hate UFC 280. This is an amazing card. The main event is probably my most anticipated matchup of the last couple years. Okay, I'm going to be watching this card. I love this card. It's crazy stacked. But the complaints I'm going to give you, I didn't just pull them out of thin air. They are 3 legitimate complaints. I want you to listen to these complaints, and then I want you to let me know down in the comments how you feel about them. And also, since I'm doing this video, I thought about doing maybe a top 3 or top 5 reasons I love UFC 280. So if you'd like to see me do a video on that in the next couple days, let me know about down in the comments as well. And as always, I'll be grading UFC 280 probably next week. I'll be giving it a grade, and I'll also be doing a bunch of breakdowns and predictions for this fight card because there's so many amazing fights. So starting with number 3, the third reason that I hate UFC 280, and again, these are the reasons, these are my complaints, my biggest complaints about the card, is that Katlyn Chookagian versus Manon Fiorot is on the main card. This isn't a terrible fight. Don't get me wrong. I'm a defender. I love women's MMA. I think there's some people who crap on it a little bit too much. This is a good fight. This is a high-level fight. This could potentially even be a number 1 contender fight, especially if Fiorot wins. But I still believe you look at Sean Brady versus Belal Muhammad, which headlines the prelims, and I'm going to explain to you the reason the UFC did this to begin with. And I've explained this plenty of times on live streams because people, every time a fight card comes out and people say, well, why did they build it like this? I'm going to answer the question of why they built it like this, but that doesn't make it any less annoying. And, this isn't as egregious as UFC 276, which was pretty stacked. And it originally had Lauren Murphy versus Miesha Tate on the main card, which made me want to throw up in my mouth. This isn't as bad as that. And that eventually, thank you to the MMA gods, that fight fell off the main card and happened weeks down the line. But it's still bad. I believe that Sean Brady versus Belal Muhammad deserves to be on the main card. And for me, I know we're getting the same fights regardless, but for me, I want the fights ordered from best to worst. And for me, Muhammad versus Brady is a superior fight than Chookagian versus Fiorot. That's just the way I feel, and I think most people would agree with me. And it just kind of throws, it just throws the card off a little bit, in my opinion. And I think that's why most people are complaining about this. But it's number 3 on the list because it's not that big of a deal. And the reason the UFC does this, because some people seem to not understand why the UFC does this. They build each level of a pay-per-view, whether it be the early prelims, the prelims, and the main card. They build it as if it's its own card. So they want to draw people in to watch the prelims. Not saying Belal Muhammad or Sean Brady's a massive star, but they think more people are going to be attracted to that fight than are going to be attracted to Katlyn Chookagian versus Manon Fiorot. That's the reasoning behind it. They do this all the time. Look at the early prelims. I think this was from 276. Andre Muniz versus Uriah Hall was on the early prelims. It was the last early prelim. The reason they do that is because they want to give people a reason to watch by giving them, a little bit better fights, than maybe the card opener. They do this all the time, and there's always complaints about this, but still, it does kind of get annoying. I would much rather see, Muhammad Brady than Dariush versus Gamrot. But at the end of the day, it's not a massive deal breaker. I'm still going to buy the pay-per-view. I'm still going to enjoy the pay-per-view. Moving on to the number 2 reason that I hate UFC 280, and this actually could be 3 reasons. I lumped this all together because, it's basically all the same thing. When you look at it on surface level, it's basically the same thing, and it involves 3 fights. It involves Petr Yan versus Sean O'Malley, Beneil Dariush versus Mateusz Gamrot, as well, and not as much, but Bilal Muhammad versus Sean Brady. So first off, you look back and you look at fights that are non-title, non-main events that are scheduled for 5 rounds. And you see Robbie Lawler versus Nick Diaz, and you see Leon Edwards versus Nate Diaz, which was on a card with 2 title fights. So that card, I believe it was UFC 263, had 3 5-round fights. Okay, and you look at Petr Yan versus Sean O'Malley. I think this is the most obvious example of this. You have a fight in the bantamweight division, a highly anticipated fight, and I believe the winner of this fight will be the #1 contender. They will fight the winner of Aljamain Sterling versus TJ Dillashaw, barring some unforeseen circumstances. So in my opinion, and I made an entire dedicated video on this when it was announced, I believe that Petr Yan versus Sean O'Malley should be 5 rounds. If they're willing to do it for Nate Diaz, Leon Edwards, if they're willing to do it for Robbie Lawler versus Nick Diaz, why aren't they doing it for Petr Yan versus Sean O'Malley? And I understand that Sean O'Malley, this is his biggest step up in competition, and maybe they want to protect him a little bit. I don't know, because I think the 3 rounds favor Sean O'Malley a little bit, but I still think he's probably going to lose. But the point is, it's not that. It's that I would love to see a guy who's potentially fighting for a title in his next fight. If O'Malley wins, he's definitely fighting for the title. I want to see what it would be like for him to go 5 rounds before he fights in a 5-round title fight. And, same thing for Dariush versus Gamrot. And I know some of those have already fought 5 rounds. But, I've said this a long time ago. I believe almost any fight that could be considered a #1 contender fight should most likely be 5 rounds. And I get it. You can't have every fight on the fight card 5 rounds. And maybe you move Beneil Dariush versus Gamrot to headline a fight night main event. I mean, Dern versus Yan Xiaonan could have used it. And I get it. That starts taking away from the stacked card. But for me, and lesser to the extent for Bilal Muhammad, Sean Brady, I still think they're probably 1 fight away. But that could be another fight night main event that could have went 5 rounds. So this is 3 fights that, I'm happy to have them on the pay-per-view. But I would love to see all 3 of those fights to be 5 rounds. In particular, if I really had to hone in on one fight, Petr Yan versus Sean O'Malley needs to be 5 rounds. It's a #1 contender fight. Sean O'Malley's never been 5 rounds. Petr Yan has been, but Sean O'Malley hasn't been, and he could be fighting for a title in his next fight. So we need to see, how it plays out if it goes 5 rounds. And I know there's some people that are going to say, well, it's not even going to last 5 rounds. I said this exact same thing about Khamzat Chimaev versus Gilbert Burns, and people called me crazy. You're not going to need 5 rounds for this fight to end. And what happened? We had a 3-round war where people complained about who won. And in a close fight, I would hate for Petr Yan versus Sean O'Malley to be an absolute classic, to be an amazing fight, but to have a controversial decision. If you have those 2 extra rounds, I believe you're less likely to get a controversial decision just because you're more likely to get a finish. You're going to test the stamina of Sean O'Malley. Petr Yan, we already know he has 5-round stamina, but you get the point. You're more likely to get a finish. Whether Sean O'Malley could be losing the fight and get a 4th-round KO. So you get the point. I just wish this was 5 rounds. I wish any #1 contender fight was 5 rounds, especially when you're doing 5-round fights for Nate Diaz and Nick Diaz, which fights that were basically irrelevant, didn't matter. And, for fights that do matter, they're not getting the proper 5-round, scheduled for 5 rounds, which I believe they should be. So moving on to the #1 reason I hate UFC 280, and this is the actual one really serious gripe I have with this card. And every time I think about it, it just annoys me just a little bit more. And it's not the biggest of deals. And I think some people will absolutely love this. I think some people will absolutely hate this. And the UFC has done this in the past for Khabib Nurmagomedov, Justin Gaethje, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Dustin Poirier. And I'm going to explain to you why they're doing this in a minute, because a lot of people don't talk about that as well. So I figured I'd bring that into the video. But you have a main card start time of 2 p.m. Eastern. You have a prelim start time of 12 p.m. Eastern. And you have an early prelim start time of 10 a.m. Eastern on Saturday, October 22nd. So basically, if you want to watch every fight on the card, and let's say you stay up late on Friday the day before, you have to go to sleep in your Venom gear if you want to roll out of bed on Saturday morning and watch the early prelims, if you want to catch the first fight, you got to sleep in your Venom gear. You don't want to be messing around when you wake up. And for me, I understand why they're doing it, but it just throws the whole day off. You know, I'm up at 10 a.m. already anyway, but it just feels weird having the fights that early in the afternoon. For me, they usually do a 10 p.m. Eastern start time, but, you know, I mean, that's not ideal. I would prefer, honestly, 8 p.m. Eastern, but 10 p.m. Eastern is much better than a 2 p.m. Eastern start time. It's Saturday afternoon. You know, a lot of people have a lot of stuff to do, and I get it. You know, you look at the UK, they're probably so happy about this start time because it's going to be a much more ideal time for them. And there's plenty of other places in the world, you know, I haven't done the calculations, that I'm sure will enjoy this time. But the UFC typically caters to the North American audience because that's where the majority of their pay-per-view revenue comes from. And what the UFC is doing here is they're sacrificing pay-per-view buys for, you know, the Abu Dhabi government, essentially. And what goes on here is basically when you have a pay-per-view, even as stacked as UFC 280, when you have a pay-per-view that starts at 2 p.m. Eastern, you have less pay-per-view buys. And this doesn't matter to me. I don't care about this at all. I'm just explaining to you the reason, you know, this is happening. But what goes on is essentially the Abu Dhabi government is paying the UFC essential revenue to replace the pay-per-view revenue that they're going to lose because less people are inevitably going to buy UFC 280 because of the start time, because people are busy primarily on Saturday afternoons. You know, you get 2 days out of the week to run around and do everything you got to do, and now the pay-per-view's coming on in the middle of the day. So what's going on is the UFC and Dana White have a deal with Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi pays them a crap ton of money, and essentially they put the card on in prime time in Abu Dhabi, because a lot of the times we've seen it with Michael Bisping, Dan Henderson too, for the middleweight title. A lot of times the UFC will inconvenience the live audience to cater to the North American audience because that's where all their pay-per-view sales come from. A lot of these other countries get pay-per-views for free or they get them in some type of cable subscription. But essentially, you know, now, you know, because looking back at that Dan Henderson versus Michael Bisping, they were in the UK. It was regular time, the regular pay-per-view start time in the United States, in North America. And in the UK, I think the main card started at like 4 a.m. UK time. They inconvenienced the live crowd because they don't care about the ticket sales. The ticket sales are a drop in the bucket compared to the pay-per-view sales. But in this instance, the Abu Dhabi government is basically supplementing the pay-per-view buys with the deal they have with the UFC. And instead, the UFC has this stacked card that they're bringing, and it's going to start at 2 p.m. Eastern time. I feel bad for you if you're on the West Coast because, you know, now you're getting a main card start time of 11 a.m. That's even more brutal. But at the end of the day, it's not the biggest of deals. I just hate that, you know, we watch the pay-per-view in the afternoon when we could be doing other things, and then that night feels really weird. It feels empty, to be honest. It feels empty. So you guys will have to let me know down in the comments. What do you guys think about all these reasons? Do you want that other video, the reasons I love UFC 280? You have to let me know down in the comments as well. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.